incorporate other kinds of orientations is not a contemporary, maybe it could be seen as a kind of a contemporary development. But the roots of these go back to the times that human society evolved. So therefore, it is just that there has been this overarching structure of patriarchy which saw things in a certain way, and it ignored, or maybe it suppressed other forms of social orientations. And today, when we have democratized, we are in a democratic kind of a political structure, we could see some of these suppressed identities emerge and also voice their concern as equal partners in the process of nation building, or maybe as in the process of what is known today as a global society. So therefore, we are not just talking about the men and women. We should also be considering, or we should also have other kinds of social orientations and sexual orientations, which we can put it under the larger framework of what we know as the LGTB and so on and so forth, the queer orientations, which are as much neglected by the social conditioning of this larger patriarchal value system, which has gone much deeper, which has defined traditionally the relationship between men and women, and thus has completely neglected the other orientations. And therefore, it's time for us to, in fact, pay attention to some of these concerns as well. And it should not be left, be in geography or in any other branch of knowledge, to people of such orientations to, in fact, talk about themselves, because this is as much our concern as anybody's, as their concern. Not that we are studying them and we should study them as social problems. We should study them as sexual orientations. And therefore, these social orientations also generate a certain kind of an identity. And that identity has to emerge with the identity of the citizenship, that they are as much citizens of any locality or a country as anybody else. We can see this, the census generates data for men and women. And it has been after a lot of struggle that, now we have the third category, added to it in our forms that we fill up, and we have been traditionally filling up, whether for admissions or for jobs or for any other place where, we are required to put in our applications, you have, whether you are a male or a female. It's good that, we may have other orientations also, other identities also, integrated into it, not as others. Because as I said, when we categorize this as others, that there is a process of othering that begins. That while the normal is men and women, others happen to be an abnormal category. Now, this perspective of othering is inbuilt into this formulation, in this classification that has been put forward by the census or by any such government or quasi-government organization, which tries to, in fact, create a situation of othering. And this has its own marginality because, because then such people are being pushed onto the margins of the society, where the policies, of course, do not address them because they're marginal, where, they are not visible, that their visibility only happens in darkness. People have been writing about it. We have fairly good amount of literature, not only in India, but also elsewhere in the world, and also in India in different languages. And we can see that the power of the society, the power of the patriarchal ethos has been so strong that even if somebody happens to, by implication, talk about any other form of social orientations, not social, but sexual orientation, such as the one, which is a very famous work by Ismat Chugtai, Lihaf, because of which, she had to be, questioned. She was brought to the court and there was a case against her during the British time. The Victorian morality of understanding men and women as the legitimate biological categories was questioned in that particular work. In our medieval society, such questioning began much earlier. Even in South, there are fairly good amount of writers, not only today, but also say about in the last 100 years, in the early stages of our independence movement. There have been ladies who have written about such social behavior, which was as normal as anybody else's. That means, the recognition of the fact that it is these sexual or what we call is the gender is basically biological, was or has to be given up. That there is no biology which is involved in it. That more than the biology, and if at all there is biology, which some of you may have this question, whether it is a biology which determines your sex, or is the society which constructs your sex, which constructs your sexual orientation, which through the process of socialization, through the process of rewards and punishment, which forces you to become a man or a woman. And that is seen to be in correspondence to the biological difference that you have between the body of the man and the body of the woman. And therefore, it's very important. And that is where, we should also take a look at the fact that how the feminist movement in the West and such similar movements that in fact have become global and also in India have really negotiated with the term called the body. Body as an identity, the body of a man or the body of the woman. Patriarchy as an institution, as a powerful institution, needs to be negotiated, needs to be questioned. Because it is this institution which has created a normalization of the body as the man and woman. And therefore, there cannot be any other because that is what, in quotes, the God created men and women. But as we know that it is not just limited to that. As I said, it's a social construction. So when we talk about gender, much of gender is an aspect of how it is constructed in the context of a specific situatedness of cultures in relation to the forces which in fact operate around us. And therefore, the structure of patriarchy, under which initially the women and the feminist movement perhaps looked at the question of trying to find their identity, half of the world population that they constituted, particularly in this binary of men and women, and the kind of marginalization, the kind of neglect, the kind of suppression, the kind of subjugation that they suffered across the world, whatever may have been the form of those societies. And mind you that there have also been societies and communities in the world, then as well as now, which had very little segregation between the man and the woman, if that is what was the gender. Because such communities, they did not recognize that one was subjugated, or one could be subjugated by the other, or could have a kind of subjugated existence. So while the first phase of feminist movement was trying to look at, fight the question of, that why there has to be a difference between the man, why can't they be treated like men? So they fought for their rights in terms of voting rights, which is known as the adult suffrage movement, because many of them, they did not have it until about 1925, even in some of the Western countries. And the second phase and the third phase, we have several phases of feminist movement. And sorry, I'm talking about feminism now, which has to be seen differently from, say, the term that we talk about gender, but feminist movement and feminist histories and feminist engagements have certainly transformed the way we are looking at the question of gender. And the question of gender is not just to be seen between the binaries, but it has to incorporate various other forms of social or sexual orientations, however small. So it's not the question of the dominant and the not so dominant. It's not the question of minority, but it's the question of how society, in fact, creates these consciousnesses as men, women, or other, or whatever may be the nature of it. And therefore, how geographers, they would perhaps try to understand this process. There have been two or maybe three different ways through which geographers have looked at this whole process. One, where it has been addressed through the instrument of what I have just talked about, is the body. The body, the human body, the physical body. Now, when we say physical body, then, you can have these bodies and you can call them men, women, or whatever. But are these bodies uniform all across? These bodies, as I have said, are socially constructed. And as one can see that the bodies were also having layers and layers of these identities which were not uniform.
Plain tables are
That means
serving is a graphical method of shaping a graphic in which the flow and plotting process simultaneously.
Could you all please participants mute yourself?
I think Ashraful, your mic is on. So if you could switch it off, that would be better.
Sorry, sir. Sorry, sir.
No, it's all right. So I was talking about, the body and how one could perhaps see this body. Can we see the man and the woman as two distinct identities of body? Or that these bodies are also differentiated in terms of race, or in terms of color, or in terms of caste, or in terms of religion, in terms of the attire, in terms of dressing. We have this contemporary problem of hijab down south, which is being reported, is one such example, where therefore the bodies are not uniform. I mean, the intersectionality of these bodies, which in fact could be seen in relation to other aspects of identities, and therefore it makes it dissimilar. So it is not simply the difference, and the bodies of the two people could be different in terms of how the body is, what is the height, and what is the color of the hair, and what is the color of the skin, and all that. But it is not just the difference, but when this difference is structured into the society which makes a distinction while it distributes anything within the society, whether it is work, whether it is food, whether whatever, that the difference becomes embedded into the structure of marginalization. So it is not simply the identity of the body or the identity of a racial body, the identity of the black versus the white body. And that the body, once it is identified in terms of A and B, or maybe M and men and women, that they are the same. This particular aspect was questioned. And that is where, the geographers started addressing some of these questions, when they were really talking about not just the body, but the body in the built space, body in the social space, which really brought in several other dimensions of structural differences, which led to not just inequality, but discrimination against a certain kind of gender identity, a certain kind of sexual identity. Therefore, men and women as body in America is not the same. The men, white men and white ladies, and black men and black ladies could be different, but there is a difference which are in fact structural between a black lady and a white lady. Between a black lady who in fact stays in some of those localities which are black dominated, like, you have the Fitzgerald, that has been studied by geographers somewhere in the vicinity of maybe Chicago at one point of time. Maybe it was not Chicago, it was some other place. It was revisited by a group of geographers very recently, and another work has come out on Fitzgerald. So it is not simply the question of the black body and the white body, and the black woman and a white woman, But you have layers of the Black women who live, say, in a residential area, as opposed to those who are living in, say, the ghettos of the black ghettos. That somebody has, a geographer has very nicely studied that, and that was done in 1960s, late 60s, 69. Harold Ross, the study is known as the Black Ghetto. That is not only in the distributive parameters, but also in interpersonal relationship. The worldview of a Black woman and a white woman, to begin with, doesn't really correspond to this structure or consciousness of a feminine body, because their experiences are so very different. So therefore, when we talk about, in geography, when we try to look at space, and then we talk about absolute space, relative space, and lived spaces. It is a lived space. It is the consciousness which, in fact, is gained through this process of a body undergoing a certain kind of an experience, where it is internalized and it is expressed through the process of external and internal interaction between the world outside, between the spaces outside, between the spaces which are there in the ghetto, which are the spaces which are there in the workplaces. While one can agree that, the experiences of women in workplaces may become similar vis-a-vis men, but at the same time, a Black woman or a colored woman or a woman from, say, what we call is the lower strata of social hierarchy, their consciousness of their womanhood, their consciousness of their experiences that they really gain through this process of lived experiences which fashion their consciousness. That means when I'm talking about consciousness, I'm talking about their own vision, the way they look at the world. Is not the same, even though the two could be working. A lady who is a white lady happens to be working at the same level with a Black lady in the same office, in the same organization, a person of yet another identity, say let's call it a Muslim woman, working again in the same locality, a Christian man and a woman working in similar, they all tend to have a certain kind of a worldview or a consciousness as a consequence of their experiences, which are not simply located in their being Black or being Muslim or being a Jewish or being a white. It is an amalgamation of a process which, in fact, is much more varied, full of differences and discrimination. I'm using consciously the term differences and discrimination, which I had talked about even last time when I said that all differences do not lead to discrimination. That the extent of deprivation of an Indian Jain lady, a woman in a Jain family, and you all know that the Jains have the highest level of literacy among women. But the extent of autonomy that she may exercise in her own personal life, which may range from, choosing education, choosing, to watch a film, to moving out with friends, making a choice for a career, to getting married to somebody, making a choice about marriage. all these, in fact, is so very different from, say, a much less educated, much less literate Indian of any other denomination, irrespective of which religion or whatever. So the point, therefore, is very important for us to, in fact, note of. And I refer to, some of the works, which have been done by some of my colleagues. I do not have the authority to, in fact, talk about gender, because that's not the area that I work on. But I had a few doctoral students who have systematically worked on this. And they have a place, they have a name. I've got colleagues, who have made atlases on women and women. Professor Saraswati Raju, an eminent social geographer, gender geographer who has worked extensively, and her work finds a place in international, and she also happens to was working as an editor on the editorial board of some of the leading journals, international journals. So what we really see is, Shubhadeep, you have to switch off your microphone. So what we really see is that most of these atlases and studies, they have indicated that when we talk about gender, it's a far more differentiated kind of a category. It is extremely varied, and that, the experiences of one set within a certain kind of a cultural identity formation cannot be seen to be the same for another. So both vertical and spatial differences will have to be, and that's where, gender and space plays a very, very important role. It is not simply the spaces inside home, which we really say the space of the woman, and the spaces outside home, which we really call it is a kind of a masculine space and the feminine space. But they're constantly transforming. They are trying to engage with one another in the spirit of seeking more of freedom from the structures of patriarchy, from the structures which in fact emerge as a consequence of changes which are happening both in the economic and in the political arena around us. And therefore, the relationship between men and women, or maybe the gender relationship, which is largely constructed in the form of men, woman, has got our education system also structured around this kind of a binary, where we say these are hard disciplines and these are soft disciplines. These are disciplines which more suit a certain gender and not the other. You can take a look at the enrollment rates, enrollment patterns in our country, elsewhere also. And you can see as to how, there were certain disciplines from where women were absolutely, conspicuously absent. Similarly, there have been certain other disciplines or certain areas where men have been absolutely absent. Things are changing. But do they really change? That's the next question. But while, those areas which are known as soft do not remain soft anymore within courts, those areas which we called as hard disciplines, like mathematics and physics and engineering, they do not remain hard anymore. I mean, there are men and women of equal abilities and training. And especially in software engineering, we can see that, there is a large number of, the space is becoming, the workspaces are getting feminized. if I'm allowed to use or borrow this particular term. While offices become feminized, and it has implications. That means, the physical facilities are also altered in the light of the fact that now you have people in larger proportion of the certain kind of body. But that is where, the physical space, which is the feminist space, has its limitation. That does this feminist space really translate into creating consciousness of equality, consciousness of togetherness, consciousness of the fact that, a man or a woman perhaps could equally move up the ladder, in that professional ladder, without any discrimination, without even having to, what we know as, trying to appease or trying to get favor. Again, within quotes, I'm using the term very consciously, of the administration, in order that, they could also compete with their men counterparts. That, in the labor market, the two are equally paid the same amount when they are engaged in the same job. That there is no discrimination. This difference in the body doesn't lead to any kind of deprivation being caused to either. That, they are evaluated on the basis of what they have contributed and what they have proven to be worthy of. Such transformation at the level of consciousness, is it taking place? And that's what we really need to look at as to when we say, okay, is the public space undergoing a change in terms of the lived experiences? Do people really feel comfortable using public transport? When choosing a job, do women choose a job next door, closer to a home? When accessing college or school or maybe educational institution, how the decisions of the family is decided on the basis of security and nearness, closer to the home, because that is where they belong. And this is how, these categories of this is translated. It's more clear in the Indian context. One can perhaps talk about that, this is a global kind of a situation, that there is insecurity elsewhere also. Yes, there are discriminations. But, the kind of discrimination that we see between and among various kinds of sexual bodies in India, where until recently the LTGB didn't even have a right to vote. In spite of us being a democratic society, they were not even enrolled as citizens because they were not covered by the enumerations of the census. That nobody gave them, or perhaps, they didn't even have the right to, in fact, ask, because they didn't have homes. So they didn't have a residence, they didn't have a place. Geography, a location, a residence, a home was essential to, in fact, prove that you could be a voter. So it's not simply, when we read about, the kind of practices which are there in our society. Unfortunately, it could be seen to be happening more among the middle classes. Feticide. The more educated you are, you have more of these opportunities, you have more of resources. And in such families, you see, in such areas where there has been relatively high level of prosperity, relatively high level of prosperities, you find that the sex ratio at under 6 sex ratio is very, very unfavorable. So even before the child is born, there is segregation, there is discrimination, there is sex determination, although it could be illegal. But there is this patriarchy which in fact governs you. In certain other areas, there could be different reasons as to why, and not to say that, those reasons are justifiable reasons, they are valid reasons, or they are invalid reasons. The fact is that these are product of a certain kind of social experiences. And therefore, the discrimination becomes far more deep-rooted. So it's not only the field, the marginality should not only be seen in terms of, and when I'm talking about marginality, I'm talking about marginality at the level of consciousness, at the level of experiences, which are largely governed by the patriarchal norms, although the patriarchal norms could also translate. And that is where, I bring in, the instrumental value that was used by Gunnar Myrdal in another paper of mine. I've talked about this, that in the name of instrumental value, one could perhaps talk about, we could have an institution, we could have an organization, a ministry called Women and Child Development, Ministry for Women and Child Development. We could be talking about women empowerment. These are all instrumental in addressing the fact that the society is trying to, in fact, alleviate the other, because they need to be taken care of in terms of educating them, in terms of taking health care to them, in terms of, in fact, looking after them, because they happen to be the potential mother of somebody. So the motherhood is a product of the womanhood, therefore is defined through the potential motherhood, which in fact is the conscious attempt within which patriarchy situates a woman. And therefore, why should a woman go to college? Why should a woman study? Not only because of the intrinsic value that she perhaps possesses as an individual, as a body, as a citizen of the society, but because, she needs to be potentially likely to be getting married into favorable families, that she should be educated because, she can look after children. Educated woman can perhaps look after children in a much better manner. That in a middle class, we see, well, woman must be looking after the kitchen and she should be more presentable in parties, that, she should be also helping children with their studies, besides, also working somewhere in some office, bringing some income, where, we use the term double work. Where the feminine place is decided not even within the structure of the household, but much more intrinsically within the kitchen. So the space that is a feminine space, angan, kitchen, the inner wall, in spite of the fact that there is an outer world where she could be operating, she could be contributing much more, she is working on the farm, but she hardly gets visible on the farm. Because people consciously do not accept that they really allow their women to work, or what has been seen as the process of Sanskritization, that once your income increases, you withdraw your woman from the work. In a certain strata of our society, while this could be happen, in another society, men could be taking pride in the fact that my wife or my daughter works in such and such factory or such and such organization, that she is educated. As long as it really serves to, in fact, alleviate your status in the patriarchal order, where women's education is seen as of an instrumental value for alleviating your status, but not as a value which is intrinsic to a person who is a woman, who is a girl, who is a daughter, who is a worker. These things are not seen as a kind of parameters of any great value. So there are different layers and layers of which that we got to really look at in order to perhaps, understand the dimensions of gender. So when you, at the master level, when you do an exercise in demography, in human geography, in population geography, when you study literacy, when you study education, when you study birth rate, death rate, so on and so forth, you should not just get carried away, because that is the kind of a norm that we have been looking at, the norm in terms of the male and the female. But even if you did that, just don't confine yourself by just looking at the data in its own potential meaning that it carries, but it also has many, many layers of undercurrents, that it also carries. And that is why I said that in the contemporary society, as the Marxian framework has been very consciously talking about this, and it is a Marxian framework which in fact brought in the question of private property, the concept of private property, where land was where property was something, which is owned by a man, that even until 2010, if not earlier, that a woman could not act to open a bank account for her son or a daughter who was a minor, had to go to the court, and this is very well recorded, had to go to the court to in fact seek this bit of favor from the constitutional bench, that the mother and the father, they both have to be registered as the legal guardian. And that's where, now our certificates, your certificates would carry the name of the father and the name of the mother, both as equal participants. And earlier, the name of the mother was not there. In my mark sheet, there's no name of the mother. My mother is incidental, is understood, is a mother. She may not have, she is a nameless and a faceless person. Her name is not important. Her face is not important. And therefore, when in the change circumstances, when we would like to see that there is greater mobility, which could perhaps help the corporate world, we would like to free the woman labor power in order that it could become an input in corporate profit making. So equality of work opportunity has not come about because of the intrinsic demand of the woman, but it has come because the corporate would like to perhaps, and that's why you see it, you can earn so much of money sitting at home. This has been going on for ages. There is a work which you can do at home. So therefore, you are being preferred. Why you are being preferred? Because you stay at home, you prefer to stay at home. where the division of labor, which is Doran Massey's famous work, between men and women, in fact, enables you to, in fact, have that extra time in order. So earlier, not that, women were not doing it. There have been women who have been rolling bidis, and they have been carrying out various other kinds of cottage level industry. But they had no claims over that because, she was owned by a man. At the level of the consciousness, the patriarchal and the corporate consciousness, when it joins, when it comes closer, then the exploitative nature of these twin forces multiply. It may show that, some people are making this kind of money and that kind of money, but does it really redefine the relationship between the man and the woman in the larger social context? Does it really redefine the relationship between man and woman in the political context? You can just see what is the kind of a statement that is made from time to time by our politicians, and you could also see as to why there are attacks on all such processes of liberal political processes, such as 33% reservation in the parliament or representation in the local bodies. There are more attacks than any favorable kind of a comment that we receive. And it happens not because the women are not capable of, but it happens because there is the gendered relationship is largely patriarchal. So therefore, the basic understanding of gender and space will remain incomplete if we have not understood the nature of patriarchy and how this nature of patriarchy itself is remolding itself under the socio-political factors, which are emerging over the years, which have impacted the relationship between what we really call is the gender relationship. In today's discussion, we are really putting it largely in terms of the binary, but that is an understanding that we must have, that we are not talking about binaries. We are talking about multiple kinds of sexual orientations, which in fact cannot be accommodated within the categorization that we have of the male and the female or the gender, because sometimes we don't have the appropriate terms. We do not have those appropriate terms, not only in English, but also in other languages. In our local languages, in Hindi, there is no such term, which can be used. And all such terms, which are used in a manner in which, they tend to be almost equivalent to abuses. So there is the whole discourse, therefore, in the social context is so abusive when it comes to identifying any other category of sexual orientation. So therefore, one should perhaps look at the fact that, the feminist geographers and the feminist movement that has impacted feminist geography in a big way has now moved into the third phase. The first phase, and that is where I will end, because, I started with something which is much more local. Now I'll move on to the much more global kind of situation in another 2 minutes' time. That it started with adult franchise. It moved into a kind of situation where it fought for equality in terms of workplaces. Then in India, we have seen that, the role of the gender and environment movement has been very, very strong, not only in the hills, but also in certain other parts of India. And most of them have not been properly documented until such a time that, there was a man who could perhaps, take on the flag and bear the torch and say, well, this is like, the Chipko movement. The Chipko movement was not started by Mr. Bahuguna or Mr. XYZ. It was started by a lady. And it was all predominantly a lady, woman-led kind of a movement. The movement that we have it again on the protection of the khejari trees and so on and so forth in Rajasthan has also born, and the movement which was largely done by women. So therefore, the role of the woman, and that is where, Vandana Shiva talks about ecofeminism, where, the ecological conditionalities and the environment movement in favor of the protection of the environment has largely been borne by women. The contribution that they have made is not only restricted to the field of what I was just talking about is a kind of feminine movement in ecology, but they have also in certain parts of the world, because of the kind of pressure, the kind of crisis which the capitalist world has generated in terms of demanding work, not only in the office, but extra hours of work in the office, at home as well, which in fact has tremendously impacted the social life, the mental life of individuals, that there have been movement to protect the human, protect the human health. That again has largely been the domain of the woman, who have led this movement. So it is not, that's the third phase. And now we are moving into a much more broader phase where, they have to really encounter and they have to really engage themselves with the kind of work, the kind of social and the work culture, which in fact is now developing in the neoliberal framework about which I have already talked about. So one can identify these 4 phases of feminist movement. The 4th phase is yet to take place, but it is likely to take place. It is going to have a tremendous impact because I can see that there are discussions which are happening in local societies, particularly with respect to, the marginalization of children, basically the girl child who in fact stopped going to school during the pandemic. So pandemic and the neoliberal framework has again created a kind of a pressure, a kind of a consciousness that women perhaps would be asking questions for the survival of humanity. So that's the next phase of engagement that is likely to happen. I mean, this is just a kind of a much more futuristic rather than, we having any kind of an evidence at the moment which could be seen to be of that nature. In Japan, I know, I'm conscious of the fact that there was a movement, but, it fizzled away. But, they did start a movement that, over time, from men or women should be banned, and they fought against this overtime culture. But that overtime culture is now transforming. You don't need to do overtime. You don't need to stay in the office spaces. So now the office spaces and work spaces are getting redefined. So with the redefinition of a space, what is really going to happen between men and women primarily, and between all such categories of gender, which in fact would require your engagement. And with these words, I will stop here. And it's almost an hour. If there are questions, I'll certainly respond to them. Thank you very much.
Sir, am I audible, sir? Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, you are very faintly audible to me, maybe because you are speaking very softly.
So, sir, thank you very much for giving us such a wonderful talk on this topic. So, we are searching for the questions. So, from the audience and participants, if you have any questions, could you please raise? Okay, I think we have got one. Yeah, Karthik Chandra, sir, you can please ask your questions here. Yes, you can ask your question.
Yeah, Bishwajit. Bishwajit Das, I see you have raised your hand. Please ask your question.
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I have one small doubt actually. So, as a lot of things has done from since your independence, lot of programs to improve that gender discrimination, right? Then where we are lacking that why the condition is still, you can say, same even in that century we are talking about gender discrimination. Even our society is the same, means we can define, is it is a social problem, economic problem, or it's a cultural problem? What kind of problem it is?
I would call it's a combination of whole, but at the base of it is the culture of patriarchy. That is the most important thing, because, to start with, say about 150 years ago, conditions everywhere in the world were the same. And to say that in 70 years we did not do anything would again be wrong. Let's not just brush everything under the carpet and say we didn't do anything. I mean, you see, if you look into any parameter, are so many women dying today? No. What has been the decline in in MMR, the maternal mortality, and so on and so forth? The life expectancy of men and women have increased. There has been appreciable shift in about 100 years. We have gone from 22 years to almost about 65 years, where in certain parts of the country, women survival rate has increased, has gone beyond men. So these are not small achievements. These achievements happen in spite of the stranglehold of patriarchy being there. And these have happened largely as a consequence of the initiatives which in fact the governments have made, civil societies have made, and these and we cannot really ignore the fact, just because we haven't yet been in a position to bring the two at the same level. The larger conflict today that is there, you may see there are problems, there are problems of violence, and one of the ways through which one can really look at violence in public spaces, violence inside homes. There are subtle ways of violences which really do not mean just physical violence. The form of violence could be just in a manner in which that we speak to one another. That there is violence which in fact has multiplied. This nature of discursive violence has multiplied many number of times than perhaps the violence which is there in the physical terms. Not that there is any decline there either. So if we take a look at the violence, the nature of violence, it's precisely because of the fact that our education, the reach of education, the reach of other elements have certainly empowered women to in fact assert themselves. They could perhaps demand something. Why can't they do this? Why can't they really study this? Why can't they go to that school? So there is, I mean, the child is no more inside our homes, as a child, as a daughter, is no more trying to become a kind of a, any kind of a second-class citizen to that of the father or that of the brother, even though younger one. So therefore, the violence are of various kinds. And if you look into the violence, if it is increasing, it is not because, this is a reaction to the fact that, women are demanding a certain degree of equality, But even have women been really consciously transforming the basic structure of patriarchy? That is the basic question. Because culturally they remain entwined within the same kind of a thinking process. they do not liberate themselves. I mean, I'm not saying that, when I'm saying, I'm not putting the blame on the woman. I'm not seeing this in terms of the man or the woman kind of a thing. I'm seeing this as a kind of a power structure within which woman is trapped. And she may exercise a certain amount of freedom, but then there are new conditions of entrapment, because of which, she has to redefine her role. And that is where, the problem is located. The problem is more cultural. When cultural notion of patriarchy acquires a political slogan, then it becomes far more dangerous. It doesn't become dangerous as long as it acquires only an economic slogan, that equal work, equal pay. It is for the benefit of all, no harm done. That woman could join the workforce, and every nowadays, what is happening? Gone are the days when, two teachers who are appointed, and a man and a woman appointed as assistant professors would be demanding the same salary. Because now every individual is employed on a different terms and conditions. So, there is no such what we call tenure record, which is meant for a particular category of teachers, a particular category of workforce. Because the culture today is that, you will apply and you will be interviewed by the HR. The HR will offer you something. I mean, that happens in a formal organization. But in a much larger domain where you have the informal work, it's very clear. It's very clear. You go and see what is happening in the Brooklyn, where the bricks are made. It is the mother and the father and the child who all work, and the payment is only made to the man. That independence, the economic independence and autonomy is also increasingly getting sacrificed. And now it acquires a new significance, and that is where it comes down, percolating, trickling down. And that cultural value, which is the patriarchal value, is now enjoined or supported by the political establishment, that it acquires a far greater kind of a... So therefore, what is the language which is being used? You can read it in the newspapers, I need not. What is the language which we use in the television? Do you think that, in 70 years' time, this was the language that we used to use on the television? So it is not, let's not get into, we have become, I tell you, we have become, I don't know. What is the term? I'm not getting that term there. We have accepted the fact that in the last 70 years, nothing happened. That all development programs went into the drain. Mind you, if that was so, we would have been at the level where we were at the time of independence. You and me won't have come to universities for education. Look at the statistics, and that is why, these statistics are important. But, there are certain favorable signs, there are unfavorable developments also. We got to really look at as to how these unfavorable developments or parameters, when the spaces of feminine freedom would expand, where the gender inequality or consciousness which is there in terms of the body and the social role undergoes a change, that it is not man as a breadwinner, that the woman could also be a breadwinner. That while a man may not be working, a woman could be the breadwinner, the real breadwinner, yet, the control over the resources is held by the man. That's the problem. And where does this problem come? It comes through what we call is the cultural value of patriarchy. It comes through, the picture of Ram and Sita. It comes through the story, not of Radha and Krishna. It comes through the stories where, the woman is reconstructed in the garb of being a Sita, who is prepared to sacrifice. Pati Vrata, Sati Savitri, these are the cultural notions, and we have elevated them. We call them, Durga, and we celebrate Durga Puja. But we don't look at our own daughters and sisters next, watching Durga Puja along with us. The symbolism rides the wave, but in substance, it is just the opposite that happens. So I would say it is more sincerely and more importantly, it is the level of cultural consciousness, that this has to be tackled, and this can be tackled. In what way, perhaps all of us know as to, we have to really look at the course of how this transformation has taken place. Why parents of the middle classes have opened doors for education, better education. They are prepared to spend money for men and women, for their sons and daughters equally, that the discrimination at home in terms of access to food did not exist, that the man and woman, they eat on the same table. The woman is not eating later when everything has been consumed in the house. Many of these practices have come down. And what has really brought these down is education, is a conscious social attempt to recognize that, yes, man and woman, or maybe any other body, has a right to survival, and they are equally important. But when it comes to crux of the matter, when it comes to marriage, when it comes to the pride of the family, when it comes to, that is where, the violence, the social violence, and there are the modes of social violences are too many. तुमने मेरा नाक कटवा दिया, है ना? तो पता नहीं हमारे मिडिल क्लास में और ऊंचे क्लास में लोगों की नाक कितनी बार कटती है और फिर निकल आती है ना? And there is a beautiful story that one satirist wrote in Hindi, Harishankar Parsai, Dohri Naak, for which he was beaten up in his own town. Long time back, he's no more, but a very remarkable satire that he writes, where he talks about the hollowness of this institution of patriarchy. We are prepared to take the claim, when Sania Mirza, wins a prize, brings a kind of a, but we really don't know. We tend to ignore the fact that what has gone into the making of Sania Mirza, what has gone into the making of most of these athletes and most of these people who have really earned a name for themselves, they have done it in spite of the discrimination. And therefore, we got to really understand and emulate those processes. That's the cultural potential that we can have. That's where the cultural route to recovery, to reclaiming your space is. We have to think out of the box. You don't have to be part of the box because you want to be part of the box. You have to get out of the box. If you're not prepared to get out of the box, you will be in the box, caged. Let me not call it you are boxed, but you are caged. So at the level of consciousness, you have to get out of it.
Thank you,
So
sir.
it's cultural,
Thank
and
you so
when
much.
culture meets politics, that is the most dangerous kind of a recipe that we are currently consuming, and we are silent. Because we are in the pride of the Hindu majoritism. हिंदू राष्ट्र बन रहा, हिंदू राष्ट्र में सीता की तरह होनी चाहिए माता। अब भारत माता जाए जहन्नुम में, माताएं हमारी क्या हालत है? हमारी माताएं जब तक बेहतर होंगी तब ना भारत देश बेहतर होगा, है ना? Hello. So let's not fall prey to what we call slogans. Yes, Ankita. Yes, good evening. Very good evening to everyone. So the question I want to ask that from the historical era, from the Renaissance time, we are facing or seeing that LGBTQ or
feminism, women empowerment, and like women are not getting that much of equality from since historical era. Do you have any suggestions or any thought about it? Why it is until now in this particular era, in this particular centuries also, women are not getting that particular rights, like like a right to vote. The women are not having that much of particular right to go and give vote on their perception, whom they want to. Your family members are deciding, okay, we are giving this person vote, you also have to give vote to them. You can't go alone. You can't go over there. Why you are going over there? They have particular perception. Can you please put a light on this? Why this kind of thought is being integrated in human mind?
I have already stated this, in multiple ways, that unless and until there is what we can call it, freedom at the level of thinking,
Yes.
both among the men and women, that is not likely to happen. But then, you have to be conscious of the fact that, when you become a voter, you become a voter as a citizen of this country, not that you become a citizen at the age of 18. You are a citizen even earlier, but you acquire the right to vote at a certain age, as Ankita Gupta, who in fact is 18 plus, can exercise her right to vote. Now, as somebody who has been authorized constitutionally to vote, you can take opinions of a dozen, thousand people, but it is your own secret ballot. Why do you really walk into the kind of a construction of a family decision or somebody who is from the family who takes that decision? I know of women who, in fact, not educated as us, we are, have exercised their votes the way they wanted to. And they are very illiterate people, they are poor people. If you do the analysis of the voters' turnout of some of those places, where people have done alongside some kind of a poll, serious studies, which Lokmat does. If you have heard of Lokmat, which is one of the agencies of a particular institute in Delhi, they always keep generating data of this kind. They have found out that women have exercised their own understanding. So therefore, it is not simply the question of, I can understand there are certain kinds of decisions which are taken by the family. Say, for example, your parents are going to decide as to which school you are going to go, because as a child, you have no idea. But when you grow up, when you arrive at such a stage where you can say, well, Papa, I don't want to go. Mama, I don't want to go there. I want to do this study. Hasn't that changed? It has changed. It has changed in certain classes. It has changed also in all strata of the society. Maybe the stranglehold is much, much, much stricter in the classical, traditional, what you can call it, dominant propertied classes. Because like I was talking about the Jains, I talked about the Jains, they are highly educated. Women have the highest level of literacy, close to about 87, 89% of them are educated, are literate. And since they are all happen to be mostly urban, they have a very high level of education. It's not simply literacy, ability to read and write. And this has been there for nearly about 3 censuses. But at the level of consciousness, they are prisoners of the patriarchal value. That value is something which is intrinsic. How you exercise your democratic value. Do you really realize your democratic value? You as an agent of change, how could you become an agent of change? For that, government is not going to release you from your family, because that's not the job of the government. For everything, government and police and the election commission cannot be standing next to you, or me for that matter. So you have to decide. If you so decide to take opinion just because you do not seem to be understanding politics, Why can't you be understanding politics? You are as much as educated as you. Maybe you are more educated than your father. You could be more educated than your brother. But your brother seems to be having an understanding. Is seen to be, is expected to be having an understanding of politics much better than that of yours. And therefore, you must take his or her opinion. Is the problem with me? So, and then the constructions that we always allude to of a certain kind of cultural values. In a modern society, if they're antithetical, we will have to give up that. We will have to give up. It doesn't define we as a democratic society. It may define we as a subset of a certain society. You call it a Muslim society or a Hindu society or anything. It makes me very, very sad that, there are certain kinds of attire, certain kinds of, अब ये कोई कहता है कि पिछले 30 साल में तो लोग हिजाब नहीं पहनते थे, अब लड़कियां पहनती हैं। अब उनका चॉइस है ना भाई। पहले 30 साल पहले तो लड़कियां जीन्स भी नहीं पहनती, तो अब उनका चॉइस है, उनको पहनने दो। लड़कियों का चॉइस है, उस पर कोई दो राय नहीं है। हम हर जगह से जो है ना, वो स्पेसेस को क्लोज करना चाहते हैं, और इसलिए क्लोज करना चाहते हैं क्योंकि हम आपको एक प्रॉपर्टी के फॉर्म में देखते हैं, प्रॉपर्टी से ज्यादा नहीं देखते। ये पैट्रियार्कल स्ट्रक्चर की सबसे बड़ी कमजोरी है। उसकी कल्चरल वैल्यू यहां से नहीं ड्राइव होती है जहां पे वो आप माँ हैं, जहां पे आप एक उसके वुमनहुड के फॉर्म में उसके जो हिंदू पैट्रियार्कल कल्चरल वैल्यू है, उसके बहुत सारे आयाम हो सकते हैं, लेकिन वो तमाम सारे चीजें जो है ना, वो यहाँ पे रिवील नहीं होती हैं। वो एक ही चीज रिवील होती है कि यू आर सब्जुगेटेड, you are secondary, you have to follow your husband. When you grow up, you have to follow your brother. When you get married, you have to follow your husband. As if, you have no ideas of, you are a brainless person. If you want to exist that way, I cannot help. Nobody can help. इस मर्ज का दवा तो जो कहते हैं ना, हकीम लुकमान के पास भी नहीं था. There is no medicine ever made. इधर सोशल पॉलिसी इतना ही कर सकती है ना, सोशल पॉलिसी एजुकेशन दे सकती है, सोशल पॉलिसी फ्रीडम इन सिलेक्शन दे सकती है, हालांकि वो भी अब नहीं है, जॉब दे सकती है। और ये बात सच है कि ज्यादातर महिलाएं जो है वो वर्क प्लेस में आई एक बहुत बड़े तरीके से आई बिकॉज ऑफ द काइंड ऑफ इनकम दैट दे नीडेड टू रन अ फैमिली कंफर्टेबली। But things have changed. People work for pleasure. People because they want to be significant. People work because they are not just tied up with money, because they want to contribute something. I see many people, coming up with all kinds of YouTubes, and women have a very large number, and some of them are really helping people. In the process, they could also be earning. But they derive that pleasure that they are contributing to the society. They have something to share. So the basic question is that it is not simply that from Renaissance nothing happened. There has been a lot of changes. Perhaps you got to really look at some of the paintings, of the times just about 100 years before. And then you could see as to what is the distance that we have traveled. So having said this, there's a lot that we need to cover. And there are many more new challenges that we have before us as society, insofar as the gender relations are concerned and categorization of gender orientations.
Yes, sir. Now, sir, we have one question on the chat box. Woman sits on the train, woman sits on the bus. Reservation of seats for women really speaks of gender equality or shows gender discrimination more?
In a society which perhaps has not learned to be compassionate. What I mean by compassionate, this can be very well, I can see where the problem is. Do you know the lived experiences of women who are traveling in buses, who are traveling in public transport? And at any given point of time, if there are 60 people inside the bus, not more than 10 would be women. And a society which will say, हम भारत में तो नारियों की इतनी बड़ी इज्जत होती है, चाहे वो बूढ़ी औरत हो, हम में से कोई खुद उसको सीट नहीं देता। बूढ़े मर्द की तो खैर बात ही छोड़ दें, बूढ़े मर्द तो फिर भी दे देंगे शायद, बूढ़ी औरत को नहीं देते, इसलिए नहीं कि वो कमजोर है, लेकिन ये कॉम्पैशन आपके दिमाग में है कि आज के हालात में उसके जो एक्सपीरियंसेस हैं, what are the kinds of risks and experiences that she has to undergo inside the public transport. And therefore you have to be sensitive enough to offer your seat. That is what is culture. That is where you do not become any way secondary. You draw a lot of pleasure when you offer your seat to somebody. Maybe that lady would refuse to take your seat. And if she refuses, please accept that. But the question is that if people do not do it, if people do not have the compassion, then the state will have to come to the rescue by segregating them. So any kind of a segregation, I am absolutely against it. Segregation in buses, reserving seats for women, reserving, having a single compartment in the metro, the front compartment only for women. But we cannot risk their travel just because, we don't agree to this. We cannot risk the fact that they have to make a choice whether to work or not to work. And if they did not work, their children will go hungry. Look at the choice that we are trying to make. It's not simply sharing the bus seat. In morning, when you travel, when I used to travel in buses, I used to work many 80 kilometers away when I started my journey, when I started my teaching in 1983. Most of you were not born. None of you were born, perhaps, other than Rameshwarji and a couple of my friends, So, what I used to see? I used to see in the morning bus, people from the labor class, people who are teachers, lady teachers, at what time they may have got up. I mean, if they have boarded the bus at 7:30 to reach their office or reach their school, and in Delhi, you have morning schools. At what time they must have made food for the men counterparts at home. They must have packed their tiffin. They must have also packed their children off to their school, and then must have made food for themselves, and then have run to the bus stop, catch that particular bus in order that she is not marked absent or late in our office. And then we do not have the compassion to even offer our seats to her because we don't want to accept her experiences. तब इसको compassion कहते हैं. अगर आपके और हमारे बीच compassion नहीं है तो कोई समाज नहीं रह सकता. डंडे के जोड़ पे चला लीजिए समाज. तो क्या है? आप कहेंगे कि भाई लड़कियों के लिए क्यों सीट्स रिजर्व्ड है? बता तो दिया क्यों सीट्स रिजर्व्ड है. और 4 ही सीट क्यों रिजर्व है? 6 ही सीट क्यों रिजर्व है? आधा का पूरा आधा सीट बस का रिजर्व कर देना चाहिए. अगर हमारे बीच कंपैशन नहीं है तो रिजर्व करना चाहिए. लेकिन ना कंपैशन होगा तो उसकी जरूरत ही नहीं रहेगी. जब वो कंपैशन होगा, जब उनके एक्सपीरियंसेस से आप 2-4 हो रहे हैं, आप समझते हैं कि वो जो ट्रैवल कर रही हो मेरी बहन भी हो सकती है, मेरी माँ भी हो सकती है, मेरी माँ जैसी है, मेरी बहन जैसी है. वो केवल एक बॉडी नहीं है जिसको कि आप ओन करने की इच्छा रखते हो. That is the most important point. That's how, what we call is a man's gaze. What is a man's gaze? It's violent. Every time a man looks at a woman, there is a violence being created. And do you think a woman is not aware of that? I'm not a woman, so I do not know. But I have taught for nearly about 38 years, and most of my students have been women. A fairly large number of them, out of 50 PhDs, I think about nearly 38, 35 of them have been women. I do not get to know everything, but I can guess their discomfort. So that's that compassion. If the society is not compassionate, the law will come and law will segregate. And any kind of segregation has over a long period of time, very negative consequences for the society. So if you don't want to segregate, then please be compassionate. No society can function just on rules. It essentially functions on certain values, principles, and being compassionate. Yeah, are there any questions? I'm not in a hurry. Today मुझे भूख नहीं लगी उस दिन की तरह.
No, sir. We haven't get any questions till now. Sir, we got to know about the compassionate, but how it can be achieved.
Be compassionate. How it has to be. There is no formula for this.
Yeah.
There's no the compassion comes through realization. The compassion comes by getting your eyes away from your cell phones and seeing the real world, your sister next door, your neighbor next door, your sister sitting next to you, your mother sitting next to you. How can you, and you have lost your compassion. Why? Let me tell you, there are so many men sitting here. How many of us have really made the morning tea for our mother? That mother who in fact must have taken to bed after we have started snoring when we were in school. She would make us feel comfortable, then, wash utensils, and by the time it's already past midnight, she is going to bed and she gets up early morning. Why can't some of us get up and make tea for her, for our mother? That's where compassion comes. You are not doing any favor. Compassion doesn't mean किसी पे वो करना, क्या कहते हैं आप, जिसका आप कहते हैं भैया देख ले तेरे को मैंने ये कर दिया, मम्मा तेरे को चाय दे दी मैंने, अब 10 रुपये निकाल दियो आज, है ना? ये कंपैशन नहीं है, वो ब्लैकमेल है. हर चीज के लिए जो आपको चाहिए होता है, आप जाके माँ का आंचल पकड़ के रोना शुरू कर देते हैं, पापा से उतनी हिम्मत नहीं होती है ना? जब आपके पिताजी आपको कुछ कहते हैं तो बात तो आप कर सकते हैं ना पिताजी से बात नहीं करना. वो सेंस ऑफ कंपैशन एंगेजमेंट से बढ़ता है. जब आप एंगेज नहीं कर रहे हैं, जब आपको पता ही नहीं कि ये तो माँ का काम है खाना बनाना, ये तो माँ का काम है. हम में से कितने लोग जाके किचन में कहते होंगे कि चलो भाई माँ ने खाना तो बना दिया, अब चलते हैं, हम उठा के सब टेबल पे रखते हैं, सबको माँ बैठ जाओ, हम सबको सर्व करते हैं. ये कंपैशन कोई मर्दों और औरतों से, लड़कियों से और मर्दों से, जब ये डिवीजन ऑफ लेबर, जो एक पारंपरिक डिवीजन ऑफ लेबर है जो हमारे दिमाग में बैठा हुआ है, इससे उभरने की जरूरत है. मेरी पत्नी को खाना बनाना नहीं आता, अब मैं क्या करूं? अपनी पत्नी को एक ग्रेड दे दूं कि वो कितनी पतिव्रता है, -1 ऑन द स्कोर ऑफ 10. उसको नहीं बनाना आता तो क्या करूं मैं भाई? उसको भी भूखा मारूं और खुद भी भूखे रहूं? तब तो ठीक है, तुम भी भूखे मैं भी भूखे, काम ही तमाम कहानी तमाम, है ना। लेकिन मुझे खाना बनाना अच्छा लगता है। मेरे पिताजी को लगता होगा कि शायद ये पता नहीं क्या कर रहा है। मेरे पिताजी को बहुत खुशी नहीं आती थी। बाद में उन्होंने मेरे को देख के चाय भी बनाना सीख लिया, और मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगा। लास्ट के 5 साल में वो मेरी माँ के उठने के पहले उनके लिए चाय भी बनाते थे। उनको लगा 90 साल इसको समझने में, लेकिन अंत के 5 साल उन्होंने कुछ किया कुछ इस तरह से। क्या हम में से कुछ लोग अपने कपड़े नहीं धो सकते खुद भी? क्यों माँ के ऊपर डाले हुए, क्यों? अरे बहुत सारी चीजें घर में जिसको कि हम बांट सकते हैं। और वो जो डिवीजन ऑफ लेबर है मर्दों और औरतों की, जब हम एक दूसरे का काम करना शुरू कर देंगे तो वो काम जिसको कॉन्शियसनेस का जो जरिया है, there is no formula, Mansi. There is only a certain kind of a process through which one has to go.
Yes, so I think that comes from the home itself, from the.
We have to share that. We have to share that. Get over this traditional division of labor.
Yes, sir.
और इससे कुछ नहीं हमें आजकल मेरे बारे में एक बार आर्टिकल छपी थी टेलीग्राफ में बहुत पहले, वो कलकत्ता से टेलीग्राफ छपा था आज से 20 साल पहले। The daddy changing diapers was the title. Daddy changing. I see my son changing diapers every day. I have a granddaughter recently born. I have become a dad. I'm a granddad, and he changes, and he does it much better than his wife. What's the big deal about it? It's his daughter. When a child grows in that kind of, my son is a very good cook, and my daughter doesn't love cooking at all. It doesn't make her any less human. She has no jhagada with her husband. So I can see it around me, that roles have reversed, and they have not really caused any major upsetting kind of a thing across ages. But while these roles in effect as physical work may have undergone a change, I would again ask this question: has it really undergone a change at the level of consciousness, where we say, okay, my wife has full autonomy on her income, to deciding as to what she must do as a family? If I say that I am the head of the family, then we should sit together, because gone are the days when there was a head and there was this. Man and woman, they both decide, okay, as things happen. And such societies, such communities, I have lived with such communities elsewhere also, and I found them to be extremely, extremely responsible parents. No decisions are just taken by the man or the woman. It is shared. भैया हम देख लीजिए, मर्दों को एक थोड़ी सी अपनी वो जो कहते हैं ना, ये जो एडवांटेज है उनको, और उस एडवांटेज की वजह से वो थोड़ा सा सोशल एडवांटेज उसकी तरह से वो जो बिल्कुल निकम्मा हो गए हैं कि घर में कोई हाथ नहीं बटाते, किसी चीज पे कोई उनकी कंपैशन नहीं होती। ये कभी ना कभी तो बदलेगा, और नहीं बदलेगा तो शायद मैं आपको एक बुरी खबर देना चाहता हूं, तमाम सारे लोग जो कि अभी शादीशुदा नहीं है। बहुत सारे ऐसे कंट्रीज में अब मैरिजेस नहीं हो रही। People are really not opting for marriage. And the percentage of women in the marriageable age group who have not married in Japan is close to about 23% today. You got to really look at what is happening in some of the metropolitan worlds, the metropolitan cities, the big cities. It's not simply living sharing spaces and live-in relationship, the commitment for marriage as an institution is declining. And that is what is an indication today. And we got to be conscious about the fact that whether we want to really save marriage as an institution, be prepared, otherwise, we will not have, men and women staying together in a bondage. This is marriage, and where they would procreate and have children as a family. There could still be families where women would adopt a child, where women would perhaps have a child through some relationship. It is her choice. No man can produce a child. Only the woman can, and she has the freedom to do that. And that must be respected. It doesn't really create a bomb. It doesn't really set the nation on some kind of a bomb. It sets the hard-hitting patriarchal man to sit on a bomb. That's where the problem is. So it's not equality of treatment only, but also not only equality of opportunity, but equality of treatment. And that's where, that's the next point, which is you got to move from equality of opportunity to equality of treatment in a manner which is just. There has to be the principle of justice. If there is no principle of justice, no society survives. And justice has to be equitable. There can be no principle of justice which is unequal. Otherwise, you will have manusmriti. If you want to have manusmriti, go ahead, have it. Yeah, when we view a person through the lens of morality created by society, and not as Sir has stated, with compassion and empathy. I'm sorry, Kesang, you have written, I feel that the problem arises when a moral duty is assigned to a person according to the gender. Yeah, it's a gender division of not only work, but also morality. You're absolutely right. But that morality in, say, a typical Hindu society that I've been a part of, I'm part of a Hindu family, born in a Hindu family. Although you can call me as they say, even if you're an atheist, you are a Hindu. So that way you can call me anything, but I have no great reverence for any religion, but I respect all religion. And I don't go to temple. I don't go to any religious place. That's my own discretion, and I am free to do that. But I do understand that when we talk of the moral duty, then that moral duty comes from this essential distinction that is made between the man and the woman. And therefore, there is separate moral principles for men and separate moral principles for women. And if you when you really look at, when you scan through the moral principles, then you can see whether they are equal or they are not equal, or whether they amount to subjugation. They are not only unequal, but they amount to subjugation. And that's where I think, we got to be very, very clear as to whether we should have. Now, when we say morality and compassion, in Christianity, there is a lot of weightage on compassion. In Buddhism, there's a lot of weightage on compassion and equity. Buddhism is far older than Christianity. But while Christianity had compassion as a moral principle, it did not lead to equality or equity. It had to be re-ingrained. In fact, the terms of equality from the Christian church is so very recent. The Pope accepted this principle of equality. The Pope accepted the fact that women could perhaps abort their children, very recently, if you look into the whole history of Christianity. So while, compassion is one set of, to say that compassion would lead to equality of treatment is not automatic. Compassion must lead to change in the consciousness. And if that doesn't happen, there is no sense of equity that is likely to happen. So that's what. Yeah, anybody else? Thank you, Abdul. Thank you for your comment on the chat box, but you were not asking questions. Not that I would not answer to your question. Yeah, there's so many ladies in the room, but there are none of them asking questions. Oh, you got to unmute yourself, Mansi.
So, sir, we are, I'm so sorry, sir. So, I think we don't have much questions. So, participants, do you have any questions?
I think I couldn't communicate. Otherwise, there should have been questions.
Yes. No, sir, it's not like that. Actually,
Yeah,
sir,
yeah. What you said, yes, was right. That was the right thing.
no, sir, it's not like yes, sir. I mean, I was about to say something, so it's just a starting word.
रामेश्वर जी, कुछ आप अपना ज्ञान दीजिए हमें, हमारे बच्चों बच्चियों को कुछ फायदा हो.
हेलो हेलो हेलो,
Yes,
आवाज आ
sir.
रही है
Yes,
तुम्हारे?
sir.
प्रणाम
हाँ,
सर,
बोलिए
सबसे
रामेश्वर
पहले
जी.
मैं आपको प्रणाम करता हूँ
अरे
जी।
प्रणाम.
पहले मैं आपको बहुत बहुत प्रणाम करते, बधाई देते, इतना नाइस प्रेजेंटेशन किया। बंगाल में 50% जो आपने रिजर्वेशन, उससे भी महिलाओं का काम नहीं चलेगा। रेशियो में वो अधिक है, पुरुषों के तुलना में रेशियो में वहाँ पॉपुलेशन अधिक है। आपने
मैं तो रिजर्वेशन की बात ही नहीं
इतनी
कर रहा हूँ साहब, मैंने तो कहा रिजर्वेशन की बात ही मत करो। 50% नहीं, जितनी भी हैं।
तो मैं थोड़ा सा लेट से पहुंचे, इसलिए मानसी देवनाथ जी हमको समय पर लिंक नहीं दी उनको। मैं फिर पूरा चीज मैं सुना नहीं सर, बहुत बहुत मैं नोट करके रखा था कि 8 को बड़े भाई का भी फिर से मैं सुनूंगा, इसलिए मानसी देवनाथ को तुरंत मांगे लिंक हमको दे दी। बहुत इंफॉर्मेटिव था, आपने सारे चीज खोल कर बताया। जापान उपान में जो आने वाले कल में शादी उदी जो है बहुत दूसरे तरह का होगा, हो सकता है कि शादी न हो, दूसरे तरह से वो लोग अपने को एडजस्ट कर रहे हो। आने वाले युवा पीढ़ी के लिए बहुत भयावह स्थिति तो है ही, लेकिन अभी इस
नहीं, भयावह नहीं है सर, ये भयावह नहीं है, ये भयावह नहीं है भाई। अब क्या करेंगे? अब देखिए, ना नौकरी है, ना नौकरी दे रहे हैं कोई, ना नौकरी पैदा हो रहा है, तो उसका तो कहीं ना कहीं असर पड़ेगा ना। अब ना नौकरी होगी तब ना आप मकान खरीदेंगे, तब ना आप किराया देंगे। जब किराया नहीं और उसके पास आपके पास, देखिए, वी हैव ऑल बीन रिड्यूस्ड टू अ वर्कफोर्स, स्लेव्स, workers, and we will be paid very little amount so that we can survive, and therefore men and women will have to share rent also, but they cannot marry because education will become so expensive, and therefore they will stay together but not have children. So it's the economic process which will disrupt everything. So you got to really correct there. हो ही नहीं सकता साहब जब तक कि वो इकोनॉमिक प्रोसेसेस पे हम कुछ ना करें। वहां तो हम लोगों को डिप्रिवेशन तो होता चला जा रहा है। अभी सबसे ज्यादा अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट रेट है। लोग इतना थक के, सीएमआई का रिपोर्ट है कि लोग थक के अब नौकरी मांगना बंद कर चुके हैं।
जी जी जी,
है ना? वो तो हम सब जानते हैं, कौन सा ऐसा घर है जिसमें लोगों की नौकरी नहीं गई है? उनके रिश्तेदारों में किसी न किसी आदमी की नौकरी नहीं गई है। कौन सा ऐसा नेबरहुड है जहां पे कि एक कारोबारी का कारोबार ना बंद हो गया हो?
जी जी।
तो ये
एक बार
ये क्राइसिस वहां पे, सबसे भयावह स्थिति वहां पे है। लड़के
एक बात
लड़कियां
और
शादी करें ना करें, ये भयावह
एक
स्थिति
बा,
नहीं है।
जी, एक बात और बंगाल के लिए सर। बंगाल को मैं देखता हूँ, ऐसे तो पूरे ऑल इंडिया के जितने भी कॉलेजेस हैं और बाहर के भी, तो बंगाल के जितने भी फीमेल्स या छात्राएं हैं, प्राय कहाँ नहीं उजाकर पढ़ी। जेएनयू हो, बनस्थली हो, बीएचयू हो, आज भी बहुत सारे हैं जो कहाँ घर है, तो मैं कलकत्ता के हूँ, मैं बंगाल के हूँ। लेकिन वो यही स्थिति दूसरे स्टेट में नहीं है। वहाँ की बच्ची बहुत दूर दराज जाना नहीं चाहती। लेकिन हमको तो लगता है कि वो बंगाल की जो भी फीमेल पॉपुलेशन चाहे छात्राएं हैं, वह बेटर हैं वहाँ के मेल एंड स्टूडेंट्स से। वह बहुत दूर दूर तक कैसे अपने घर परिवार को छोड़कर उतने दूर जेएनयू में, मानसी देवनाथ शायद वहीं गई थी जेएनयू की, कहा इनको पता नहीं, बहुत दूर दूर लोग जाना। इन लोगों को बधाई के पात्र हैं कि कम से कम घर परिवार छोड़ के इतनी अपनी दूर जाकर पढ़ती हैं। तभी ना यह सारे जगह देखा जाए तो इंडिया का हर कोने में इनकी अपॉइंटमेंट देखी जाती है। वो छत्तीसगढ़ हो या जेएनयू हो, दरअसल सारे लोग बंगाल से जाकर वहाँ नौकरी करते हैं। इनको हम विशेष रूप से बधाई देते हैं। ऐसे तो छात्र वहाँ के जाते हैं, चाहे मेल पॉपुलेशन, तो वो तो कहीं जा सकते हैं, लेकिन इन लोगों को जाना उतना हम इंडिया में बहुत देखे, कहीं देखे नहीं। ठीक है सर, तो बहुत मैं नहीं सुना, इसलिए सर आप बहुत कुछ इस पर नहीं बोले। नमस्कार
नहीं
सर।
नहीं, देखिए ये एक और चीज है कि वो शायद उतनी सुविधाएं वहां पे नहीं है, या बंगाल में जिस तरह की सुविधाएं वो ढूंढ रही हैं, जिस तरह की अपॉर्चुनिटीज वो ढूंढ रही हैं, वो नहीं है। तो शायद वैसे घर से दूर जाना किसी को भी अच्छा नहीं लगता, चाहे वो लड़का हो या लड़की हो। और इसीलिए मैंने कहा ना, एक्सेस टू अपॉर्चुनिटीज
नहीं,
बड़ा
ऐसी बात
जरूरी
तो
हो।
नहीं। वहां पर शांति निकेतन है, कस्तूरी
नहीं,
मुखर्जी वहीं
लेकिन
से।
वही है ना कि वो डिमांड और सप्लाई वाली बात है।
जी जी
ऐसा कोई वो चॉइस नहीं है। अगर अगर वो चॉइस है तो शायद वो एक पूरे हिंदुस्तान के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में अपने आप को देखते हैं, तो बहुत ही अच्छी बात है जो आप कह रहे हैं।
जी जी जी।
लेकिन जिस तरह से अब तमिलनाडु से बहुत सारी लड़कियां, ऐसा नहीं है कि तमिलनाडु में लड़कियां अब लड़कों से पीछे हैं,
ना,
लेकिन
ना,
तमिलनाडु की, हाँ, वहाँ पे,
वहां से आती है,
हाँ,
वहां से। जी।
हाँ, वहाँ पे
के-
उनके लिए वो सुविधाएं, वो तमाम सारे,
केरला भी ठीक है, मैंने
is much
तुलनात्मक है
better
केरला।
than what it is in Bengal. Yeah, it could be. Similarly, in Kerala also you can see that,
तमिलनाडु जी।
yeah. So yeah, there are places where बिहार से तो हर तबके से लोग, वो लड़के लड़कियां भी आ रही हैं। एक उस
जी
स्टेज में
जी
आ गए हैं लोग, बच्चे आ गए हैं, तो अब आ रहे हैं। मिडिल क्लास इज अ वेरी रिसेंट फिनोमेना in the urban areas or in
बिहार
rural
वाले तो
areas
बड़े
of
बड़े
Bihar.
आईएएस रैंक में जाते हैं। जी जी जी।
Sir, I want to
मैंने
add one thing, sir.
ऑफिसर के दृष्टिकोण से तो
Yes, sir.
जी जी।
Arindam, बताएं।
Sir, I want to add one thing regarding that the Dr. Rameshwar ji what said about the Bengal, the females, those who are go from one place to another for teaching, like or like for colleges but I have also seen that many students from the Bihar or UP and Rajasthan, they have very specialized, not only the male but the female. Most of the females, they go for UPSCs and all those things, like what you just said. I was thinking about that one only, like and engineering also, like they are also doing some good jobs. The females from the UPs, Bihar and the Rajasthan, they go for UPSC, not like only the Bengal. There are some opportunities from every states, like the south,
What happens is,
the
Arindam,
South
what
Indian.
happens?
Yes,
Yeah. Please complete. Please complete.
the South Indian, like there is a trend, like the most of the people that they go for the like technical divisions, like engineering, like Navy and all those things. The females, if we see the job ratio all over the country, we see a trending ratio according to the states. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, but that's also very important for us to, in fact, understand that when when a person from Bihar steps out, a men or a woman, there has been two classes. One is, of course, the traditionally propertied, educated classes who have always had some kind of an education. And for them, since they didn't have any dearth of resources, they, like in Bengal, one can say, in Sharachand's stories, or you can see, references to, people, setting up, a family setting up small homes in Kolkata for the education of their children. And that is what was the kind of a Bhadralok syndrome which developed. The fact is that, because of the initial movements, which in fact happened, the structure of power or the role of power there was not so much of an appreciation in our society, in the Bengali society, just for, or there was no such sense of deprivation or awe for power. But in Bihar, let me tell you, I'm from Bihar. And so when I came to JNU, that was, and my father knew that, I'm a person who I'll always talk my mind, even when I was 19 years of age and was coming to JNU. I had a very open interaction with my father. I used to have among all my brothers. So he said, "Samay mile to UPSC bhi kar lena." I mean, that was the kind of a bottom line. So I could understand what, people in Bihar, in UP, they are psychologically having a total enormous awe for these powerful positions. And that emanates from a kind of a perpetuation of feudal relationship. The feudal relationships in Bengal were questioned by people who were effectively social reformers, right from the times of Raja Ram Mohan Roy to a whole lot of people. I mean, they were the ones who talked about women's education. Sharat Chand talked about women's education. He, in fact, set up schools and colleges. And you can see, when you are liberating yourself from the feudal mindset, then the awe for power declines. And when the awe for power declines, there you will not, you'll see men and women trying not just one kind of a job, but they are trying to diversify themselves. And the Bengali girls and boys, they are not only for the UPSC, but they are trying to diversify themselves. And they don't come to Delhi in order to take UPSC examination. But a feudal society, like, talked about Rajasthan also, they are going for something for which there is a demand in the market, and there is an awe, a social value, and that is what really attracts them. And from their locality, that is the expectation. So the aspiration is not their personal alone, the aspiration which is that of the family aspiration, and aspiration which comes from their locality as well. So it's a combination of these factors, which we really don't see in Tamil Nadu either, because, there was Tamil Nadu and Kerala, had undergone this anti-Brahminic movement. So there was a very subtle attack on feudalism. And there was also, the movement of the Periyar, which really tried to liquidate caste. So, these were some of the factors which really changed. So it is not state-wise. It has to be seen in terms of various layers as to who is doing what and from which particular locality, from which particular class. And things are not the same as it was at the time of Periyar and post-Periyar. In the early days of DMK movement and so on and so forth, things are changing in Kerala. Things are changing also in Tamil Nadu. And things could be changing also in Bengal. I do not know, but you have to really be sensitive enough to understand those dimensions of change. So one has to rather see it in terms of a larger framework of the regional ethos and preferences, which I would not disagree with you that yes, there is some kind of a trend. Like in Bengal, anybody who takes geography, the first thing is that, kuch nahi milega to school mein teaching to mil jayega. So the demand for school teachers is one of the most important attractions. But in Bihar, that's not the attraction for taking geography or taking any discipline. Nobody wants to become a teacher in school, especially from a certain class. that is not their choice at all. So it's either that or nothing, it's either highway or no way. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So we don't have as much questions now. So we can end this session for today, but it was marvelous speech, sir. I just wanted to actually previously whatever webinars we have done under the banner of Future Geographers. So most of them were focused on the physical aspects of the geography subject matter or the newly upcoming geospatial techniques. It is just the 2-day series was just some kind of varied things. That's the unnoticed part of the geography, as we can say, because yeah. So I think some parts we have reached to the participants that this are the major things, the major social issues, and aspects of geography where we can look after. And thank you again, sir. Now I am hand it over to Devanjali Banerjee for giving the vote of thanks. And also thank you all the participants who presented both of the sessions. And hopefully you have learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, since we have come to the end of this program, on behalf of the Department of Geography, School of Basic and Applied Science, and the organizing committee, I, Devanjali Banerjee, student of BSc Geography Honors, feel immense pleasure to take this opportunity to propose the vote of thanks to our eminent guest, Professor Sachidananda Sinha, who gave us his valuable time and inspired all of us. I would like to express my gratitude to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Dipendra Kumar Jha, respected Dean Sir, Professor Jitendra Kumar Pandey, our HOD, Dr. Kasturi Mukherjee, all the faculty members, Dr. Supratim Kormakar, Dr. Tuhin Bhadra, Dr. Rajiv Sarkar, Dr. Partha Bosu, Dr. Anu Rai, Dr. Manushi Paral, Dr. Monisha Devnath, Dr. Shuman Chatterjee for supporting us throughout this session. And also, I'm very grateful to my fellow coordinators, Raka Hajra and Monlar Busu, for conducting such a wonderful session. And finally, I would like to sincerely thank all the participants for joining the second session of the Future Geographers 10 and for making it a successful one. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devjani. Thank you, Mansi. Thank you, everybody. Rameshwar ji, namaskar.
Sir, I would like to
once again, सबसे पहले मैं सचिदानंद सर को प्रणाम करते हैं. भाई चांसलर महोदय जुड़े हुए हैं, कस्तूरी मुखर्जी जी जुड़ी हुई हैं, मनीषा देवनाथ जी जुड़ी हुई हैं, देवजनी बनर्जी जी, सारे लोगों को भी नमस्कार. थैंक्स सो ऑन. नमस्कार. नमस्कार
सर. Professor Sachidananda Sinha sir.
नमस्कार सर.
Like to invite you again.
सर नमस्कार.
नमस्कार जी. मेरा खुला. हाँ, ठीक है जी. मानसी, क्या आप कुछ कह रही थी?
Yes sir, we would like to invite you again.
I'm always there, but yeah, I'm deciding not to talk. I'm going into a silent mode, like phones go into silent mode. So I will be talking only until the end of February, and then after I'll go into silent mode.
No, sir.
वानप्रस्थ का समय हो गया है.
साइलेंट मोड हम लोग स्वीकार नहीं करते हैं. हम लोग आपके आशीर्वाद के बराबर हमको याद करेंगे. साइलेंट मोड में आप न जाए.
साइलेंट मोड सबसे अच्छा मोड है, तभी तो बहुत मजा आता है. खुद ही सोचो, खुद से बात करो, है ना. बुढ़ापे में लोग कहते भी हैं, बुढ़ा जो है ना अपने आप से बात कर रहा है. तो